in order to sort of kick off this series, How to Get Past Your Past, we're going to have to go back into our past for a moment. I want to go back to the year that many of us probably try to forget, the year of 2020. Some of you are like, can we just skip 2019, go to 2021? If you're in San Francisco, it's more like 2022. Can we just skip that? But we can't. We have to go back if we're going to go forward sometimes. It was the year 2020, and all of us have been introduced to a new world with new language, new rhythms, and new behaviors. And one of those new behaviors that we had to get used to, that we all had to adopt, was the behavior of wearing a mask. Do you remember at the beginning of COVID how optimistic we were? Right? I don't know if it was just me, but I talked to many of you that, like me, thought at the beginning, this is just going to last a few weeks. This is just going to last a month. Did anybody else kind of think that at the beginning? We were so hopeful. But then, obviously, it didn't turn out that way. But at the beginning, we were like, man, what the universe has given us a month off, a month to bake bread, ride our Peloton, and binge watch Tiger King. You know, we were like, this is great. But we all had that moment, right? That moment of epiphany where we realized, this is going to last a bit longer than we all thought, right? I remember that moment for me. It was when I was on Instagram and I was scrolling, and there was these ads that kept coming up from these variety of clothing companies, and they were selling their newly designed COVID masks. That was the moment for me where I realized, I think this might go on a little bit longer, because they were promoting masks with like graphics and designs, and it had this like really soft fabric on your face. And then remember, it came out with like the nose pinching thing so that your glasses didn't fog up. They were like, wow, we're taking masks to a whole new level. And I realized we're going to be in this, I think, for a little while. Now, during COVID, we all had a lot of shared experiences. Not only wearing a mask, we shared that experience. We also shared the experience, or at least many of us had the shared experience of Zoom happy hours. Does anybody remember those? How awful was like hanging out on Zoom? It was the worst, but we all shared that experience. And then this last experience, and it's relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, is we had the shared experience of doing everything possible to avoid coughing in public. Does anybody remember that? That fear of if I coughed too loud or if I coughed too aggressively in public, everyone's head would whip in your direction and arrows would be shot through their eyes as they assumed you obviously have COVID. Oh my gosh, what a crazy time to be alive. But I remember this shared experience of not wanting to cough publicly because I didn't want anyone to think I had COVID when I didn't. And so I did maybe what some of you did, and it was awful. I would try to hold in the cough as long as I could. Have you ever tried to hold in a cough? It's second to only holding in a sneeze. It's just not fun, right? And the more you try to hold in a cough that is trying to get out, it's like your eyes start watering. And then you realize, I can't hold this thing in forever, so you do like the semi cough. You're like, right? and all these noises start coming from you, and it gets really weirder than it probably would have been had you just released the cough. And I realized something during this. There's some things that we try and shove down and hold down and swallow that just need to come out. And I've realized that's not only true for a cough every now and again, but it's true in life. That there are some things in our lives that we will experience, some battles we will endure, some wounds that we will have, that we just cannot shove down, hold down, or swallow any longer. Because if you try and swallow it, if you try and shove it down, if you try and suppress it, at some point you make a big scene. And you end up maybe even making things worse for yourself had you just been honest with whatever it is that you have been trying to swallow and shove down. And so this series is about us holding space for one another to cough, to let out whatever it is we maybe are holding in and suppressing, so that we can begin to breathe and live more freely and more fully. Are you with me, Canvas? And so today I want to look at a story as we start this series in the book of Genesis about a woman who's running from her past. And she finds herself in a situation that she didn't ask for. She finds herself in a situation she didn't want to be in. Have you ever found yourself in one of those places? And so she does what many of us have done, what I've done, probably what you've done. And that is that she tries to run from her situation. She tries to run from her pain, run from her struggle, and run from her past. And while she's running, she finds herself in the middle of the desert. In the story in Genesis, an angel of the Lord, we're told, meets this woman right where she is as she's trying to outrun her past. Don't you love that as fast as shame and fear and guilt might be, that God's love is even faster? I'm so grateful that God will always outrun me and does, and meets us right where we are in our most vulnerable moments. In fact, what's beautiful about this story that we're about to read is in the Bible, this is actually the first time recorded in Scripture that an angel of the Lord shows up to a person. And I find it interesting that the first time recorded an angel shows up to a person, the angel doesn't show up to a king, doesn't show up to a queen, doesn't show up to a religious leader. The angel doesn't show up to that person who seems to have every I dotted, every T crossed, but the angel shows up to a person who has more questions than answers, who has wounds, who has baggage, who has a past, and doesn't know how to get past it all. And the angel shows up to them, and I don't know about you, but I take that as good news. Because I don't have it all together. How about you? And I don't have all the answers. How about you? And there are some things that, if I'm honest, I've tried to outrun. And I'm very grateful that God meets us right where we are, not with shame or guilt, but with grace and with love. And that is the story we're going to read today as we begin this journey today of getting past our past. It's a strange story. I'm just going to be really honest from the get-go. You're going to read this and think to yourself, that's bizarre, because it is. It's one of those Old Testament stories that sometimes doesn't quite carry over into our 2024 world. But I believe that the truth and values that we're going to extrapolate from this story very much transcend time and generation and will be relevant for our lives today as we get past our past. You have three characters at play. You have a woman named Sarai. You have her husband named Abram. They had been given a beautiful promise from God that they were going to be the parents of many generations, too many children to count. But they found themselves childless in this moment. Have you ever found yourself in a moment in your life where what you believed God was going to do and what is actually reality in your life didn't seem to match? That's where they are. It's frustrating, and they try to take control, and they're afraid and prideful. And so they try to take matters into their own hands, which brings their servant Hagar into the equation, and that's where our story begins. In Genesis chapter 16, verse 1, it says this: Now Sarai, Abram's wife, had not been able to bear children for him, but she had an Egyptian servant named Hagar. So Sarai said to Abram, "The Lord has prevented me from having children. Go and sleep with my servant. Perhaps I can have children through her." And Abram agreed with Sarai's proposal. So he didn't even object. He's like, all right. So Sarai, Abram's wife, took Hagar, the Egyptian servant, and gave her to Abram as a wife. This happened 10 years after Abram had settled in the land of Canaan. And so Abram had sexual relations with Hagar, and she became pregnant. But when Hagar knew she was pregnant, she began to treat her mistress Sarai with contempt. Then Sarai said to Abram, "This is all your fault. I put my servant in your arms, but now she's pregnant. She treats me with contempt. The Lord will show you who's wrong, you or me." And Abram replied, "Look, she's your servant, so deal with her as you see fit." And then Sarai treated Hagar so harshly that she finally ran away. The angel of the Lord found Hagar beside a spring of water in the wilderness along the road to shore. And the angel said to her, "Hagar, Sarai's servant, where have you come from? And where are you going?" Can we just say that question out loud so it gets from our head to our heart for a moment? The question that the angel asked Hagar is this. Let's say it out loud. Where have you come from? And where are you going? "I'm running away from my mistress, Sarai," she replied. The angel of the Lord said to her, "Return to your mistress and submit to her authority." And then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count." And the angel also said, "You are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears. For the Lord has heard your cry of distress." It's a strange story, to be honest. But let's look past some of the strangeness of it and look at the journey that Hagar is on, because what we'll find, I think, in a lot of ways, is that her journey might just be your journey as well, and my journey. As she finds herself in what feels like an impossible situation, a lose-lose, one that she didn't want, one she didn't ask for, and so she tries to outrun it and get past it, but she can't. And so God intervenes, just as I hope God will maybe even intervene in some of your lives today and stop you from running and instead invite you into a healing journey that will lead you past your past. But I want to be intentional in saying, and I've said it a few times, hopefully you've caught on, that throughout this series, what we're talking about is starting the healing journey. I think sometimes in places like this, and oftentimes by people like me, the way we talk about healing isn't always very helpful or realistic. And what I mean by that is sometimes I've noticed that the church, because we tend to struggle with struggle, we want to get you through it as quickly as possible. And so we're like, well, if you just pray, then it should just like magically disappear. But anyone who's ever dealt with depression, anxiety, or any sort of wound knows healing does not happen overnight, it happens over time. And so I want to be very, very clear that your healing journey is one that will happen over time, and it is a lot less like getting a root canal, painful but quick and you're over with it. That's not what healing is like. Healing is a lot less like a root canal and a lot more like brushing your teeth. That you just got to get good at dealing with the daily consistent gunk that can build up. Healing is a daily decision. In fact, I would argue that healing is not some event that you just like, I have arrived at healing. Healing is much more a daily decision. It's an invitation that you accept every day to engage in your healing journey. And this is exactly what the angel offers Hagar, an invitation to get past her past. And he begins this journey by asking a question that is beautiful and haunting and sort of poetic. He stops this woman in the middle of the desert, in the middle of her running, and he says, where have you come from? Where are you going? Isn't that an interesting question? He knew who Hagar was, right? He acknowledged her name. He knew where she was in the middle of the desert. You would think as an angel of the Lord, he would already know why she's running, but he asked the question anyways. And maybe it's because the information wasn't for the angel. He knew it was for Hagar to engage and accept the invitation. You see, no one can accept the invitation of healing on your behalf. That is an invitation that only you can accept each and every day. He says, where have you come from? And where are you going? And I wonder today if the angel of the Lord that showed up to Hagar showed up to you. And if that angel asked you the same question, where have you come from? And where are you going? I wonder what your answer might be. Maybe for some of you, if you look back towards your past, you would say, I've come from a pretty toxic family, very, very destructive family. Maybe some of you would say, I've come from abuse. Maybe others of you, I'm coming from losing a loved one. Maybe for others of you, maybe I'm coming from a relationship not working out and your heart is broken and you're wondering if you're ever going to find the love that your heart and soul longs for. Maybe you're coming from a divorce. Maybe you're coming from an affair. Maybe you're coming from a family that is physically present but emotionally absent. Maybe you're coming from a lifelong battle of anxiety or depression. I don't know what you're coming from, but all of us are coming from somewhere. All of us have a past. You're a product of it. But this question invites us to go a little bit deeper. Is there any part of your past that you're coming from that you're actually also a prisoner of as well? Because our past, it's always sort of informing our present, isn't it? Whether it be subconscious or conscious, our past has a way of continuing to talk and inform us and lead us in our present if we're not careful. Where have you come from? And where are you going? If I were to rephrase the angel's question, I might rephrase it to say, what past have you come from? And what are you actively doing about it? What past have you come from? And what are you actively doing about it? And luckily, the angel doesn't just pose this question and then disappear. He doesn't go, where have you come from? And where are you going? And then go back up to the sky or whatever. That's not how it goes. And I love that. God doesn't just drop these provocative questions and not hold us by the hand and lead us forward. And the angel meets this woman where she's at and then begins to lead her forward. And he invites this woman to take 3 steps. 3 steps that we could actually bring into our world today. And in fact, I would go as far to say, if you want to get past your past, you're going to have to take these 3 steps. And I'm not just saying that as someone who's not walked through it. I'm saying it as someone who is still walking through it. And so the first step that this angel invites this woman, Hagar, to do is he invites her to acknowledge her past. The first step of getting past your past, according to this interaction between Hagar and this angel of the Lord, is you got to acknowledge your past. And this is what we see in the verse. It says, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai, she replied. The angel goes, where have you come from and where are you going? Well, I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. Isn't it interesting? She does something that I think if we're really honest, few of us do all that well. And that is she didn't respond with generalities. She didn't respond with, well, I'm just really stressed out. Life is just tough right now. I thought I'd go for a very long walk down in the desert and wilderness. No, she doesn't say, I'm just really busy. I'm tired. She doesn't do any of that. But she does what few of us do, but need to do. She gets real specific about the problem. She gets really specific about why she is where she is and the effect it's having on her life. I'm running away from my mistress Sarai. See, it's so important that we acknowledge our pain and we acknowledge our past and we get as specific as possible. There's something that happens when we actually say out loud what it is we're running from. When we say out loud the wound that we've experienced, when we say out loud what my parents did to me and how it affected me, or what that person did to me and how it has affected me, it's not easy to say out loud, which is why few do. But the hard work of showing up and getting past your past will require of you to make eye contact with that which you're running away. Because you will never be free from what you're unwilling to face. You're never going to find freedom from a past that you are not even willing to face and acknowledge its presence in your life. See, there's a fundamental difference between healing and avoidance. And sometimes we confuse the two. And some of us, we say we're healed when really, no, you've just gotten really good at avoiding. Which is why when you get triggered, all of it comes to the surface again. Which is why it always seems like you maybe take 10 steps back, but then one little thing happens, or even a big thing happens, and you're back to square one. See, there's a difference between healing and avoidance, and Jesus did not give his life to help you avoid problems. He came, lived, and died so you could rise above them, so you can rise above your past and be fully healed and fully alive. You see, avoidance, if you do it long enough, it's not healing. You've just learned how to walk with the shackles on your feet with more efficiency. You've just learned how to almost accept it. I don't want to be a church that allows you to accept that or allows you to live your life avoiding your past. I want to invite you to rise above it by beginning to acknowledge it. In fact, there's something about saying out loud your past and what you went through that begins to almost, when you do that, it's almost like you're taking power back. It's like you're almost, by saying out loud what it is you went through, you're beginning to empty that past problem, wound, struggle, trauma of its power by acknowledging its presence in your life. Paul, he talks about this in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. I have the scripture wrong on the screen. Sorry about that. But it's 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9 through 10. Paul, he talks about this. He talks about how he realized actually vulnerability and embracing your weakness, embracing your struggle is the path to power. He says this, he says, so now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses. And what I love about that first line is that it's actually very human, it's very honest. By saying, so now I'm glad to boast, means there was a point he wasn't glad to boast. That there was a point where he didn't think you should boast in your weaknesses or acknowledge your weaknesses or face your weaknesses. But at some point, who knows when, he learned that actually strength is not found in pretending that you're okay when you're not okay. That strength is found when you open your life and your heart and you tell the whole story, the true story of your life, and embrace not only the good parts, but also the messy ones. And he says, so now I'm glad to boast about my weaknesses so that the power of Christ can work through me. That's why I take pleasure in my weaknesses. What a strange thing to say. But Paul says, I take pleasure in it and in the insults, hardships, persecutions, and troubles that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, I am strong. If you're anything like me, you don't like feeling weak. Like I just not my favorite feeling in the world. And what Paul is saying here is that when you actually embrace vulnerability, as Brene Brown said, vulnerability is telling your whole story with your whole heart. When you live this life telling your whole story with your whole heart, acknowledging all the parts, good, bad, light, dark, easy, and difficult, when you acknowledge it, what Paul learned and what we'll learn is that God's power moves in that space of vulnerability. But you will never, ever, ever, ever get there if you're not even willing to face and acknowledge what it is you're running from. So the first thing is we got to acknowledge our past if you're going to get past it. But the second thing we see in the story is you can't just acknowledge it, you actually have to engage with it. So it's not enough to just say, well, this happened in my life. You actually now need to engage with it and say, what are we going to do with it? What is it doing to me? What does healing look like? And begin to do the hard work of engaging with your past, which, by the way, is why I am a huge fan of therapy. We are not a church where we just say, well, pray it away. Can I just be really abundantly clear? It's not prayer alone, it's prayer and. Do I want you to pray? Yes, prayer's awesome. God moves in prayer. In his presence, there is freedom and liberation. I believe that with all my heart, but I also believe it's prayer and therapy for some of us. It's prayer and doing the hard work. It's prayer and boundaries. It's prayer and the courage to say no. It's prayer and looking your trauma in the face. So you got to engage with your past. And that's what happens in verse 9. It says, the angel of the Lord said to her, return to your mistress and submit to her authority. How annoying was that? Right? This woman, she's like, do you forget why I'm here in the first place? This is why I'm here. I don't want to go back to her. And he's like, here's how we're going to do this. Got to acknowledge it. Then we got to actually engage. We got to engage with our past. And so the angel says we got to begin to show up and do the work. And see, the paradox of getting past your past is that before you can go forward, you will likely need to go backward. That you will likely need to go backward and begin to do the work if you're going to be whole and healed and engage your past. And now that's very 30,000 foot, I understand that. What does engaging your past look like? It can look a variety of ways. For some of you, perhaps it is going to the source of your greatest hurt and pain. For others of you, it might not be physically or emotionally safe for you to do that, and you actually need to go to a therapist or go to a counselor, and that is the better option. I think there's many ways to engage your past, and the key is that you choose one way and begin to engage and do the work. It's important to understand what your parents said to you. It's also very important to engage with what they said to you and understand how it marked your life and how you carry it into your adult years. It's important to explore how or it's important to understand and say out loud that loss that happened in your life. But it's vital for you to not only look at the loss that happened, but acknowledge how it's affecting you here and now. It's important to understand why certain things trigger you and how it's connected to your past. We must be aware, but then we also have to do the hard, brutal, long work of engaging. And it's when we understand how our past has informed us, and for some of us, how our past has even deformed us, that we are better equipped to experience a reformation of our heart and soul and lives and experience the healing that God wants to do. So you got to acknowledge your past. And then you got to engage your past. And then here's the third part. And a lot of times in churches, we start here and don't talk about the previous 2 points. But I don't want to forsake this last point because it's so important. You got to trust that God will bring good out of your past. You got to trust that God will bring good out of your past. Acknowledge it. I see you. I know it happened. We're aware of it. I'm not avoiding it. And now I'm engaging with it. I'm doing the hard work. I'm showing up, working on myself, understanding how this affects me. But you know what? I'm not going to lose my hope that God could somehow, some way bring good out of our past. And that's what happens in verse 10. It says, then he added, I will give you more descendants than you can count. The angel of the Lord says to Hagar, look, if you acknowledge what's going on, if you engage with what's going on, then I promise you that God will not waste anything that you've walked through. He's saying, look, you're going to have so many descendants that you can't even count. Now, for some of you, that may not sound like a blessing. I don't know. But what the angel really is saying to all of us, what he's saying to Hagar is, your story will not end here. This chapter will not be your story. It will just be a chapter. The story that God is going to tell in you and through you will be greater and more beautiful than this moment that you find yourself in. And not only will your pain not be wasted, but you'll have something to pass on to the next generation. See, what the angel is telling the woman in the middle of the desert is if you will acknowledge and if you will engage and if you will trust, God will bring good out of your past. Some of you just need to write that down. You need to put it on your mirror. You need to write it on your arm with permanent marker and don't wash it off. Like, God will bring good out of my past. And this is what Paul would later on write. In Romans chapter 8, verse 28, he says, and we know that in all things, everyone say all things. He doesn't say some things. He doesn't say a few things. Paul says in all things, God works for the good of those who love him and who have been called according to his purpose. Now, let me just have a little side note here, especially to all my followers of Jesus who've been raised in the church space for a little while, chances are you've heard that verse before, and you maybe even heard someone like me in a place like this tell you, see, everything happens for a reason. Has anyone ever heard that before? It was like 7 years ago, we did a series called Dumb Things Christians Say, and that is one of them. That's one of them. Everything happens for a reason. It is a platitude meant to help you in your pain, but it's really just not that helpful, is it? And it's even worse, not what Paul is saying here. Paul did not say everything happens for a reason as if God was behind the cancer, God was behind the miscarriage, God was behind the affair, God was behind your loss, God was behind your disappointment. That is not what Paul is saying. What Paul is saying is there's nothing that you could experience in this lifetime that God cannot use as material to build a purposeful future with. What Paul is saying is the affair, that person made that decision, God didn't cause it, but you know what? God can use it to make you stronger. That loss of a loved one, God didn't cause it, but you know what? God can use it to make you a stronger and a more whole person. That there's nothing that this life can throw your way that God cannot work with. And that is what Paul's saying. He's saying, look, all things that you will endure in this life, God, He can mold it into something beautiful. Right? I mean, gardens grow out of crap. God can use. It's true. Sometimes, I don't know about you, sometimes I just wonder, like, if God gives us these little hints as to how He works. And we see the beautiful garden, but we forget often where it came from. Why can't God grow something beautiful out of the crappy situation you have experienced? He can. And we got to trust that God can bring good out of our past. You see, getting past your past, it's not about changing your past. That's a really frustrating process. When what you're really trying to do is change your past. Your past is your past. You can't change your past. See, if you're going to experience healing, it's not about changing your past. A lot of times it's about changing your mind. Why is it that you could have two people with very messy pasts and one person rises above it and the other person is crushed by it? I guarantee you, if not every time, 9 out of 10 times, it is because that person chose a different perspective on the situation than the other did. And they rose above it. If you're going to move past your past, you got to acknowledge your past, you got to engage your past, and you've got to trust that God can bring good out of it. Can I give you a little bit of an analogy? I'm a visual learner. Any other visual learners in the house? All right, cool. So hopefully you'll like this, and hopefully it'll work better than first service. Let's go. So let's just say right here, these 3 cups of water, there's 2, and then here's the third one here. Let's say these each represent a generation of your family story. You have your grandparents, you have your parents, then you have you. See, what happens is, and let me actually just take a step back and be intentionally clear about this. I don't want to project that your family's a hot mess. Like, I don't want you leaving here and thinking your family's awful if it isn't, but every family's different. And some families have a lot of skeletons in the closet. Maybe yours doesn't have as many. But I do know this, that as long as your family line is made up of human beings, that there will be good things and there will be some bad things. Simply because we're human. There will be some good things that are crazy destructive, and then bad things that are crazy destructive. You're with me. And then there's going to be some families where maybe the bad things are a little bit more subtle, a little bit more discreet, but they can be just as destructive as well. Maybe for some of us, what this looks like is maybe a couple generations ago, all of a sudden, some pretty big things started creeping into our family line. Maybe it was, adultery or affair, abandonment. Maybe it was, maybe it was violence. Maybe it was emotional, physical abuse. Like, I don't know what it could be. Maybe it's smaller things. Things that can be destructive, but they're kind of sneaky, like materialism. Or maybe you're in a family that's like uber perfectionist, all about being perfect. And so you just never feel like you're ever going to hit that bar. You're never going to amount to anything because of this narrative of this thing that's kind of creeped into the family story and polluted it a little bit. And it has to begin somewhere. Because, again, you did not become who you are on accident. At some point, something broken entered into the family story. And here's where things get really interesting and important. Is that problems that are not stopped will eventually become patterns. And what we see happen again and again in families is that we see a problem that isn't stopped, it is not faced, it is not dealt with, and all of a sudden that problem becomes a pattern, and then it gets passed to the next generation. And then if it still isn't stopped, if it still isn't faced, if it still isn't dealt with, then it goes to you, and it passes on to you. The Bible refers to this as generational sin. Psychologists call this generational trauma. But the point underneath all of that is whatever you do not transform will eventually get transferred. Whatever you do not eventually transform will get transferred. And it's so important to understand this, because if you don't understand this, chances are you will take the patterns that will have been given to you and you will give it, good and bad, to your kids or to the next generation. Parents in the room. I'm a dad, and for all my parents in the room, I want to take a moment to maybe speak a little bluntly to you, that if there are some areas of brokenness in your life, in your marriage, in your family, you owe it to your kids to get therapy. I don't care how expensive it is or how uncomfortable it is. How much is your child's future worth? It's worth far more than you will ever pay for therapy. And if you ever want to break a pattern, you will have to acknowledge it, engage it, trust God with it, and begin to break that pattern. In fact, for some of you, this is why Thanksgiving is so draining, right? You're laughing because it's true, right? You go home, and because you have multiple generations that haven't dealt with their junk, not only are you sharing turkey and stuffing and pie, you're sharing trauma. And you're at the dinner table, and you're just like, oh, will you pass your trauma? Yeah, here's a big old plate of trauma. Here's toxic behavior. Here's it all. And by the end, then you come home, and you're like, I'm exhausted. Why am I so tired? This is exhausting. This isn't the way it was meant to be. And you may not be responsible for the patterns that were given to you, but you are responsible for whether you will give it to the next generation. Let me zoom in on married couples and single people in the room. This would be really important. I see this all the time in married couples. You get a married couple that has trauma and wounds and baggage that they didn't deal with, they're not aware, or they are aware but they didn't engage. And you have this couple that they've got some polluted water here going on, and then they get married, and it's going to be awesome, right? Until this starts happening. And this is your marriage. Just sharing your trauma, back and forth, not getting any better. Why are we fighting all the time? Why does he trigger me that way? Why does she trigger me that way? Why does this keep happening? Or why are we in this hamster wheel of struggle? And most of the time, it's because you have two people who have trauma they've not become aware of or engaged with or actually trusted God with and began the healing process. So single people in the room, can I give you a little advice? You can take it or leave it. It's not like in the Bible or anything. It's just my opinion. I would advise, don't even consider getting married to someone who is unaware or unengaged in their trauma. Don't even consider it. And honestly, you shouldn't consider getting married until you are aware and engaged with your past and your trauma and beginning that healing journey. Now, am I saying you need to be healed to get married? Absolutely not. No one get married. But you need to, right? But like, do you need to be healed to get married? No, but you should probably be healing. And they should be healing in their journey that they're on. But here's the beautiful part, and this is the good news, is that when we start doing the work, we start showing up, we start acknowledging and practicing engagement, whether it be through therapy or friends, or all the above. And we begin to open our heart up to what God wants to do in our lives, and we say, I am not going to become a prisoner to my past. I am a product of it, but I refuse to be a prisoner of it. Then we see that Jesus, who also goes by the living water begins to pour into your heart, pour into your soul, begins to overflow and push out the pain and struggles and wounds. And where there was despair, there's destiny. Where there was hurt, now there's hope again. Where there was pain, now there's purpose. Man, where there's frustration, there was faith. And now, oh my gosh, now all of a sudden, over time, everything that was there, everything that was handed off to you, it's not there anymore. It's no longer invading your present life. You're living your life full, purified, reformed, clean, free, and alive. And you know what's beautiful about this analogy, why I think it works? I didn't just pour the water in once and all of a sudden I was like, bing, and now it's clean water. Did you notice it took some time, and gosh, at the beginning it probably was like, it's still red, Travis, still red, it's still a mess. But like over time, the red started to fade a little bit more, a little bit. It's why you can't quit. Some of you, you're like, I still got stuff, and it's like, yeah, because you're only half full right now. God's just getting started. We got to continue to show up and open up and allow God to meet us right where we are, because, and here's the really, really good news. Here's the really good news. If you acknowledge your past, you engage your past, and you trust God can bring good out of your past, here's the last part, that God will turn the tables on your past. He'll turn the tables on your past. Verse 11 says this, and the angel also said to Hagar, said, you are now pregnant and will give birth to a son. You are to name him Ishmael, which means God hears, for the Lord has heard your cry of distress. What a beautiful ending. When the story started, this pregnancy was a symbol of her pain, of her loss, of her struggle, and of her past. That's why she was running. Her pregnancy caused all this turmoil. But now in the end, God says, if you acknowledge, if you will engage, if you will trust, I'm going to turn the tables on this. And this symbol, this baby that represented your struggle, will now represent an entirely different story. A story about how God hears you in your distress, and God meets you in your moment. And that, my friends, is what God does when he heals you in your life. He turns the tables on your pain. He's a pro at it. He's good at it. Give him a chance to show off in your life. He'll turn the tables on the pain in your life, and that wound that you have will not just become a scar, but even more, that wound will become a scar, and that scar will become a birthmark that symbolizes a moment in your life where a new life began. A new beginning started. And see what's awesome? I have a fourth cup. Is that when you do this work, you do the healing work, you acknowledge, you engage, and you trust. God turns the tables, and not only does he change your life, but here's beautiful. This is the future. Maybe it's your future kid. Maybe it's just your future in general. I don't know what, but here's your future. You begin to now pass on something entirely new. You get to pass on a beautiful story to the future. One of the greatest gifts that you will give the future. One of the greatest gifts you'll give your children if you have children. One of the greatest gifts you will give the future is your story of healing. The world needs the healed version of you. So let's do the work. Acknowledge, engage, trust, and watch God turn the tables. Let's pray.